listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by RealAgriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
Land. It's hard to think of a resource that is more important for farming and agriculture. Land provides value to not only the people who own it and farm it, but society as a whole in many ways, depending on how it's used, whether it's to grow food, to raise livestock, as natural habitats, or as the base of a concrete parking lot or an apartment tower. Decisions around land always have that economic aspect to them, but they're often political and emotional too, with a lot of strong feelings involved. As people always say, they're not making any more of it after all. So we're kicking off a new season of the Ag Policy Connection podcast here on Real Agriculture, together with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, focusing on the future of farmland and land use decisions across Canada. I'm your host, Kelvin Hepner. This is part of CAPI's new PLAN initiative. PLAN stands for Policies for Land Use, Agriculture, and Nature. And on this episode, which we're calling episode 1 of season 3, we're going to dip our toe in the water, so to speak, on some of the big challenges around land use in Canada, possible solutions, policy-wise solutions, the role of government versus the role of the free market and industry, and much more. So we're excited to welcome in this esteemed panel. First up, we have Margaret Zafiriou. Margaret is a senior research fellow with CAPI, an economist who spent several decades working for the federal government on agriculture files going back to the early 1980s. She's been with CAPI now for the last number of years. We're also welcoming in Tom Nuds. Tom is a distinguished fellow with CAPI and professor emeritus at the University of Guelph, where he taught and conducted research in the field of conservation biology, also going back to the early 80s. And rounding out our panel for this initial discussion on land use policy across Canada, we're pleased to welcome back to the Ag Policy Connection, Nicholas Mesley. Nicholas is a distinguished fellow with CAPI. He's a well-known reporter, journalist, photographer in French agriculture media based in Quebec. And I learned this just recently about Nicholas. He was actually a press secretary to former Minister of Agriculture, Eugene Whelan. That's going back a few years already. And it's always good to have his perspective coming from the province of Quebec as we get things rolling here with season 3 of the Ag Policy Connection, focusing on the future of farmland and land use policy across Canada. We're pleased to welcome Margaret Zafiriou, Tom Nuds, and Nicholas Mesley, an esteemed panel here once again, leading this season off here on the Ag Policy Connection. And Margaret, when we talk about CAPI's PLAN initiative, kind of the basis, the foundation for what we're focusing on here over the coming weeks on this podcast, can you fill us in on what PLAN is about and why CAPI is focusing on this topic?
Yes, thank you very much, Kelvin. Yes, PLAN, which is sort of short for Policies for Land Use, Agriculture, and Nature, is a project that was funded through RBC Tech Fund and Agriculture Canada's Agri-Competitiveness Program. CAPI has done a fair amount of work in the past around land use issues. We produced a report 2 years ago on competing pressures for land use. We developed a land mapping tool that's up on the CAPI website, and we've produced various commentaries, opinion pieces out in the media on this issue. We also did some work for Edmonton Regional Metropolitan Area on their growth plan. So what we identified was that there are lots of gaps in this area, and there doesn't seem to be sort of some overarching strategies for dealing with land use pressures in Canada. So that is one of the reasons that this PLAN program was suggested. And as part of this PLAN program, we have a policy network which brings together several thought leaders, many thought leaders, to discuss various aspects of land use issues. we started that several months ago. We've had 3 sessions so far. We have about 40 experts who are involved in the plan network, including both Professor Tom Nuds and I believe Nicholas Mesley. So that is helping us sort of get a group of people together to discuss the issues, engage, develop a network that will expand the knowledge and awareness of this issue in Canada and hopefully result in some solutions. We also have 4 doctoral fellows under the PLAN program. These are some young doctoral candidates who put forward some proposals around land use issues, and we're very excited to have launched that. We have some ag economists, we have some geographers, and we're very excited with their proposals that will be coming out over the next year. We also have a distinguished fellow component of the PLAN program, and Professor Tom Nuds, Dr. Nuds is one of our distinguished fellows and has done work, will be doing work and helping mentor the doctoral fellows, being involved in the policy network, and also developing his own research report. And he can probably talk a bit more about that. So that's kind of the PLAN program that we hope to make advances in knowledge around land use challenges and policy solutions in Canada over the next 6 months to a year.
All right. Thank you for that introduction, Margaret. Tom, going to you and your background, coming from having taught and done a bunch of research in the field of conservation biology through the University of Guelph. What do you see as the reason for why land use matters? Why we need to be having this type of conversation as we head into 2025?
I think by and large it's because a lot of people take land for granted. It's always been there. We've always had food from it. You can walk on it and see nature and so forth. And I think, for a lot of individuals that operate in different spheres within the overriding, shall we say, societal level issues that complicate stories and approaches to how we use the land. I think we need something like this plan initiative to bridge those silos where those other conversations go on without a greater appreciation of other values and other perspectives and so forth. It's always been a concern of mine, and I worked for quite a while at the what I call the science policy, what everybody calls, I suppose, the science policy interface. And trying to bridge that. And it's astounded me really. I mean, how much of that work has been done in the social and humanities side of the thing, in which I was not previously, before some years ago now, well versed. How a lot of those tools and techniques to mitigate uncertainty in collaborative decision-making models, the natural sciences people could learn a lot about. And that's where I've put a lot of my energy, is into thinking about finding myself at the radical middle ground between groups of people who have different values and perspectives on why the land's important and how it ought to be used to better appreciate some of the other competing values, and to encourage actually exploring greater solution spaces for win-win scenarios that a lot of people approach the problem already have made up their mind. There isn't a win-win. There's got to be a winner and a loser here. And so that's where I like to put my energy, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to work with CAPI this year on furthering some work I did on that just before I retired from the University of Guelph 12 years ago now, on challenges with estimating extinction risk of species at risk on private land, where it's difficult because of the narratives that are out there to have people collaborate in an open, transparent fashion, and allow access to people who would investigate because of repercussions under the law that in some case looks to me to be just a little too egregious. If it's collaboration we want to actually encourage. So that's where I come in.
Mhm. I appreciate your description of the space you work in. And to me, that's one of the things that we're trying to do here too with this podcast is kind of work in that science policy interface and bring together the different perspectives. And so I can relate in terms of working in that space. And Nicholas, you have a background working in media as well. And of course, in media, we tend to gravitate to those areas where the collaboration that Tom is talking about isn't working, where there's conflict, where there's issues around disagreement, and land use is one of those. We can find examples of that when it comes to conversations around land use as well. What do you see as pressing challenges for land use in Canada? And again, why does land use matter? Why should we be having these conversations, Nicholas?
Well, let's put some numbers here. Like Canada is the second largest country in the world. It has the land, it has the water, and it's the fifth largest exporter of feed, and in the world. So when you look at the actual situation on a political view, the invasion of Russia and Ukraine, which is a big wheat and corn exporter, when you look at other, I would say, issues, Canada has a role to play. Now, when you look at land use, one of the key elements I'm looking at is urbanization. So urban spreading on the best agricultural land, which if you look at the past, these agricultural land has always been lakes, water, and with the increase of population, you have a pressure on those agricultural land. So one of my work as an investigative journalist is that I look at speculation around Montreal, Quebec. We have to say that it's not like Saskatchewan. Quebec has a little Nordic garden, less than 5% of its territory. You can produce food on it. So the pressure is real. Is there. So who are those speculators? Should the land, agricultural land, be bought only by agriculture producers? Should investment funds be able to buy big chunk of lands, either in Quebec, in Canada? And now we are, how could I say, from a federal point of view, you don't have too much to say because agricultural land is a responsibility of the provinces. So most of the provinces have voted a law to protect their land from foreign investment or to kind of protect them from urban spreading. But you have a lot of holes in there, like a Gruyere cheese. So that's where I come in.
Mm-hmm. And we just saw an example to get into a specific case here where the provincial government in Quebec is currently considering new legislation to restrict who can own farmland, right?
More or less. What happened is that the law was voted 45 years ago by a minister whose name was Jean Garon, and he was very pro. He wanted Quebec to be self-sufficient in food and production. Like export imports to have a good commercial positive balance. But yes, the I would say that the review of the law is to modernize it and try to stop the speculation. Just a few numbers here to make your auditors really understand what's going on. Is that you have about 40,000 agriculture producers in Quebec. Most of them are, I would say, 55 to 60 years old. So in the next 5-10 years, you will have a lot of transfer of land to either new generation or new buyers. Who will buy those agricultural land? Under what conditions? What type of production? So you see, it's like if you look at the average farmer age in the rest of Canada, it's the same dilemma. So there's a lot of questions to be answered here.
Mm-hmm. Margaret, does Does it feel like these land use decisions are increasingly about food security in terms of the conversations we're having about farmland?
Well, food security certainly is one of the main issue because it's something in the longer term. We know that with the world's population growth and the increased demand for food, and Canada being, as Nicholas said, the top five net exporters of food around the world, we can be a supplier of this food to this growing population. We do have a fair amount of land. Canada-wide, like Nicholas said, for Quebec, only 5% is arable, I believe. In Canada, it's similar, like 7%. Only 7% of Canada's land is in agriculture production. So it's really important to protect it for the longer term, for long-term food security. Otherwise, you can see chaos and prices rising immeasurably. So it's a sustainability issue, certainly. And some of the provinces, as Nicholas said, it's generally provincial jurisdiction, but there's also the jurisdiction of the municipalities. So the province kind of controls the overarching policies around land use, but then you get into all the municipalities. There are regions in Quebec, for example. Quebec is a wonderful example. It has this loi sur la protection des territoires agricoles. It's been very transparent. You can see when anyone wants to convert prime agriculture land, they make it very transparent who wants to do it. But there are regions in Quebec that would like to have more economic development that are surrounded by agriculture land. So there's also those issues. So it's a real balance to sort of, okay, you have prime land, you want to protect it, but at the same time, you have to have a certain amount of economic development. So this is the dilemma. This is a wicked problem. It requires you've got multiple stakeholders. It requires collaboration, consultation, transparency, certainly. And Ontario, for example, which went ahead and was going to develop part of the green belt without people knowing about it. That showed this lack of transparency, but quickly they had to backpedal on that because people found out about it. So these are the issues around land use and prime ag land and urban sprawl, and it certainly raises all these issues that Nicholas has suggested already.
Marianne, it shows you how the Greenbelt project was taken in hands by the citizens themselves near Toronto, because Mr. Ford couldn't move very as he wishes. So just to say that when you say municipalities and cities, you touch a huge problem, which is how the municipality pays for services. So in Quebec, as in the rest of Canada, they count on fiscal, their fiscal recipes counts on the tax on the land, immobilière, on sait. So they have that revenue, and it puts a lot of pressure to develop condos, to develop supermarkets, to develop all kinds of things in order for them to receive the money they need to give services to their citizens. And this is where urban sprawls come in, and the individual car. So you need more near big cities like that. You need more common transport en commun. You need like train, buses, and things like that to put less pressure on the agricultural land.
Mm-hmm.
I think,
Go ahead,
Nicholas, to your point about what drives that urban sprawl, I think it's clear that what that decision making, again, that considers the revenue income from development to the exclusion of other considerations to balance that, what are the costs of that when we go is a classic example of the kind of thing I'm talking about when Margaret mentioned, stole my line about wicked problems. The problem with wicked problems is that the idealist thinks that a silver bullet solution, policy solution, will come riding over the hill, and bang, all we got to do is take some chunk of green belt and we'll make more houses and we'll solve that problem. And then, of course, it blows up, right? What's amazed me these last few years as I've gotten more into this topic is, the growth of ideas that have been around at least 30 years in the academic literature, but not getting much attention until relatively literature around the green economy and so forth. There's been a kind of a coming of age now, a recognition that natural assets, in fact, have monetary value. And they may not be cash in the bank now, you can go and buy a chunk of land with, but that land not developed represents deferred, it avoids future costs. I mean, the bottom line is compact, less development and so forth will be more economically efficient going further. Now, I probably sound like I'm making up a silver bullet solution of my own, but this is precisely why we need for these groups that think differently about these things to come together around the new tools and techniques that we could learn a lot about from the management sciences in terms of how you engage with stakeholders in participatory research and do evidence-based, take an evidence-based approach to mitigating that uncertainty, right? With the transparency and so forth that Margaret's talking about. There's a lot of room to move forward with these kinds of approaches, and we're starting to see more of them.
So if we're talking about public goods, though, that are coming from private land, public goods could be food security in the long term, or biodiversity, or conserving species at risk, that type of thing. How do we have the tools in place, Tom, to measure and convey the value of those public goods when it comes to land use decisions, and help, I guess, have that long-term perspective, not just the short, maybe political cycle driven perspective on these decisions?
Yeah, I think so. I'm intrigued with some of my more traditional economist friends are less intrigued than I am, but I guess that comes from not being an economist. I'm kind of like, you say, well, just hold on a minute. Let's see what they have to say about this. If you look at the Nature Investment Hub, and you look at the Natural Assets Initiative and so forth, there are. Let me put it this way. When I see that the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada are putting on workshops for chartered professional accountants about how to get the value of natural assets on the books of municipalities to show as assets and not liabilities, okay, something's changing here, right? These are CPAs, for gosh sake, right? When you see the investment firms in Canada coming out with their reports about risks and so forth. We're going to build infrastructure and then have it destroyed, in ways that we didn't anticipate under 400 years of more stable climate than we've seen for a long time. We've built up all of these policies and expectations in an uncharacteristically stable period of Earth's ecology, and that's changing more rapidly now than it did in the past. And our decision-making institutions are not particularly well prepared to make the sort of nimble decisions that we do when we take the sectoral approach, right? So, yeah.
Nicholas?
You might invite those folks that I was just talking about to maybe future episodes here. I don't know.
Yeah. Go ahead, Nicholas.
If I can go along with what Tom is saying, is that to pay for ecological services from the nature, this has been on the low for a while, and we should come up with a price, on the services that nature can provide you. And I invite you to go see some of the documents provided by the Green Belt. I think it's the Green Belt Association. They have some calculation. Even when they had the COVID-19, they were able to come up with a figure for mental health. I mean, when you were caught in your in your apartment downtown or something like that. If you could go walk in nature, I mean, if you want to go fish, you want to go hunt, it's a services for the good of humanities. And only now around Montreal, they are thinking of doing a kind of green belt, but they are years behind. So when you look at I would say the cost of using one car, the cost of the greenhouses gases, you are able to put a price on the ecological services, but now it has to be, as Tom said, we have to implement them in a way that it's part of a budget, if it's a municipality or a government. And we should do it quick because we are in the mid of, I would say, climatic change crisis, food crisis, which may come. Mm-hmm. So, there's a kind of emergency, I would say, to act. We cannot wait 40 or 20 years more.
Yeah. The challenge is going to be at the level of the individual landowner. We'll have to have these sort of programmatic institutional level changes. I agree that scale well there. And what Nicholas was talking about is, I'm not overly familiar with that particular example, but similar things have been done with other in other areas. And I think that if we pay, as Nicholas says, if we pay more attention to how to engage with the individual landowners, we'll make more progress on those sorts of approaches. We'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, and if I could just get a comment in here, and Nicholas, I'll go to you. But the idea of landowners being told how they can use their land is often not something that is well received if it includes new restrictions or reduced options in terms of potential uses for that land. Same goes for property owners in cities who don't like restrictions on what they can do with their property either. So to me, there's a challenge there in terms of how do we find policy solutions that can advance recognize the value of these public goods without, like you said, Tom, you need to deal with the individual landowners and find ways of having a kind of a win-win scenario, maybe where they also have a carrot or an incentive to advance something here. Nicholas, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, well, just to say that I would invite you again, Canada doesn't have such a program, not a province has that, not the federal level. But I would encourage you to double check what is called a conservation program under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Mm-hmm. So you've got about 28 million acres per year, which can be set aside for 10, 15 years by it's a voluntary program where the producer can put some part of his land under various conservation program, either water, we don't have that. So, the Americans, when you look at it, there is good and bad, but in terms of I would say protecting their fertile land, they have a program which exists since, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the conservation program is early 1980 or before. So it could be something to look more in deep, and maybe to serve as an example. Now, if you go to Europe, which is totally different, the producers get paid even to, I would say, to have agriculture in mountains to produce cheese, because they put a price on the beauty of the nature. If you go to France or Switzerland, you will do bicycling or trekking in part of in the mountains where it's nice. So producers are paid to, I would say, to entertain some of the postal card that they have in Europe. It's a total different approach where the farmers get paid for various ecological services. So again, Canada should be, look at somewhere and adapt that to your own, do your own recipe.
Mm-hmm. Margaret, while Nicholas is speaking here, I just used Google to find the USDA website here. Last year, the annual budget for the Conservation Reserve Program in the U.S. was $1.8 billion, the largest conservation program in under the USDA umbrella. So I guess that brings up the question of who pays for these public goods provided by privately owned lands.
Well, that's paid for by the American taxpayers. Certainly, it comes out of their budget. Now, they do have a huge deficit in the US. So who is paying for their deficit? Well, it's probably Chinese citizens who, own treasury bills or whatever. Anyway, or other citizens.
Future American taxpayers might be paying
yes,
for it.
perhaps. But it is a good program. It has lasted. They evaluate the program, and we see in the literature analysis of it, and there's different mechanisms how they take this land out of production and how they bid for it. So producers will say, yes, this year I'm going to apply for the conservation reserve, and so I'm going to put in a bid. And I believe one that I was part of the program I was recently reading, it was a reverse auction. So it's sort of they put together the bid, how much the producer is willing to sort of accept for taking that land out of production. They also make use of an environmental benefit index. So they try and evaluate the environmental ecological services that comes from taking that land out of production. So they're kind of way ahead from that point of view, right? They've been doing that, as Nicholas said, from the 80s, because I remember when they were studying the 1986 Farm Bill and they were talking about this stuff. So they are ahead. So now we do have some programs in Canada that are more nonprofit, like for example, our Alice program, which we often talk about, where it's through the charity of individual companies, and they support landowners who will convert a piece of their land that's perhaps a riparian zone and look after it so that we have in Canada we have more of these sort of nonprofit or charitable type of ways of doing it, but certainly at the national level, our programs are a little different, and we do not have something like that. So that's a good point, Nicholas. Yeah.
Well, we've known for a very long time, those of us who work in the waterfowl world, that you could pay farmers not to farm. That wasn't the biggest challenge. And you can measure responses in at least one ecological good and service, which was the surplus of huntable ducks paid for by the American hunter through fees to the North American Waterfowl Management, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. And so for all of that was begun back in the mid 80s with the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, which was touted at the time as the largest landscape restoration experiment ever undertaken. It just had an unfortunate name called waterfowl. So people with other values back in the days when the anti-hunters and the hunters are going back and forth at each other, well, it takes a long time, talk about decision-making institutions, to walk something as forward-looking as that was. Because in a sense, what Ducks Unlimited does on the Canadian prairies to address the similarly steep gradient in land value between crops and cattle, crops and cattle that we have between development and any farmland at all, right? That's the driver that's common in both those systems. And what DU does is, they essentially act as an agent, a binational agent for willing sellers of that ecological good and service and all its co-benefits to us here in Canada. The ducks get up and fly away for free. But now the farmers, compensated if he signs up for he or she signs up for their buy, save, sell, lease programs. Ducks Unlimited will restore cropland back to grazing land, take a 30% hit, recover the money from the United States. And before the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, there was no money in the United States earmarked for conservation outside of the 50 states. And so this was a huge change. Now, if you just blow that up and you substitute biodiversity for ducks, and carbon sequestration and so forth, and you think about a market of willing sellers and willing buyers for those, we might be able to address that steep gradient that exists between the green belt and the urban areas, and then outside the green belt, where I live in southern Ontario, the development just leapfrogged over the green belt and landed on us 20 years ahead of when anybody was ready for it. I mean, it's almost chaos out here, to be frank. And so anyway, so those kinds of potential market opportunities might exist. And in one sense, it's a way to let the value of the ecological goods and services kind of float, right? 20 years ago, Costanza talked about ecological ecosystem services and valued it at several $trillion. But I mean, the idea was, okay, we have all this clean water. What would it take technologically to replace it? That was fundamentally the way to win at the problem. But that doesn't scale down to the individual farm. The individual farm is a mix of, some wetlands, some woodlots around here, some fence rows, all of which aren't necessarily biological deserts when it comes to valuable carbon sequestration and biodiversity reservoirs. Unfortunately, that's the narrative that's out there that goes on between people who have different sets of values and perspectives on the proper use of that land that creates, I think, huge opportunity costs for everybody. How ineffective and inefficient are our laws and policies when it comes to trying to address these wicked problems? Because of the scientific uncertainty that is simply exacerbated by inability for the scientific community to get the evidence we need to do really good risk evaluations of threat status for species. Some may be underprotected relative to the real situation in nature. Some may be overprotected. When you think about when I listen to Nicholas here talk about the enormity of the problem we're facing, my little corner on species at risk management on private land seems kind of small. But when I think of the size of the civil service that is assigned to work on these issues, and the amount of time they spend spinning their wheels in debate and fractious arguments and so forth, I think there's a huge cost there. I wouldn't begin to know how to actually measure, but I'm sure if we did, we'd realize that opportunity costs are everybody's enemy, and therefore a common one that we ought to be at least coming around on.
And that might be why why you're seeing accountants now looking at ways of recognizing that opportunity cost in terms of accounting documents.
Yeah,
Nicholas, I see you taking notes while Tom is speaking here.
Yeah, it's about the, in Quebec, one of the big problem, I told you we have a little Nordic garden, but it's a little Nordic garden which is not in good health. Why? Because it was corn, soya, pork. Corn, soya, pork. Corn, soya, pork. No health taken into the land, into the soil. So good soil is a carbon sink. In Quebec, actually, most of the land has less than 4% of organic matter. Mm-hmm. So here comes the market, where if a farmer has increased his organic matter on his land, could he be paid? Because the land is a huge carbon sink. If you talk to every expert on that, they tell you, look, it's fantastic. So is there a way for farmers to get paid if they increase their carbon sink? Nobody has yet found a protocol to evaluate that. Let's say in 10 years, if you increase from 3% to 5%, or 15 years later on to 5 or 6%, this is a way to retribute the farmers. When you think that in Canada, the price of a ton of pollution, CO2 equivalent, will be $170. So could a farmer with a certain amount of hectares or acre could get paid? This question, sorry, has not been solved yet. Would it be one day? I mean, if you talk to the American what's his name? Agriculture Secretary Vilsack, he's talking about those things. But he called that climate smart agriculture. Will he succeed to develop that? I don't know, but it's certainly something to follow up. And to the question to Margaret, where comes from the money? I'm sorry, but I will take an idea from the left, and it's why don't we tax the movement of capital around the world? You put a little tax on those amounts of money, and here you can ameliorate the society by huge time. These things, Mr. Trudeau has been talking about it since I don't know how, and it doesn't lead anywhere. I understand it has to come from a very large consensus, but hey, this is where money can come from. Anyway, I'm finishing like that. I just wanted to bring the point on the CO2 equivalent, the carbon.
Good. Those are good points. Yeah.
That's one where the carbon markets, you go back a few years, there was a lot of talk about farms seeing carbon as an additional revenue stream, and it feels like the development of that market has fallen behind on the excitement that there was for that. And I'm not sure whether that rests with government or whether industry. Nicholas, do you have thoughts on how that market or that assigning of a monetary value to that soil carbon, how that can be advanced?
The problem is developing a scientific protocol for it to evaluate it. But also, if you're a farmer, let's say you're a farmer and you increase your organic matter from, let's say, 3 to 6% in 10, 15 years. Let's say that in 15 years, you've got a problem on your farm because of climate change or whatever. You need to plow your land. Who will be responsible? Who will pay you? You know, all that challenges, and in 15 years, you and me, we don't know where we're gonna be. So you know, it has to be. You have to develop a system which will be perennial in time, to make sure that the farmer doesn't become I would say, the victim in that. He has to profit, and the society has to profit.
Mm-hmm. Margaret, and speaking along these lines, I guess maybe this is a higher level question, but this was one of the things we wanted to touch on here is how policy can provide solutions to some of these issues. Here in this specific example, I guess government can develop these protocols and the market can develop these protocols in terms of how we define and measure and verify and track soil carbon. What do you see in this area in terms of advancing the policy to provide solutions here in terms of potential on some of these pressing issues that we've discussed here?
Policy solutions. Well, like they're wicked problems, so they require consulting with all the stakeholders that are involved. I don't know. They're at the provincial level or at the municipal level. I liked when I found what Quebec had done with its Commission de Protection de Territoire. Okay, so it was sort of a way of managing the development of the ag land. Okay, there's problems with it, but they were transparent and they consult. Now, the minister often has veto, so he can just decide, oh, I do want that Google plant going in there, or that Amazon warehouse, even though there people don't want it. But up to democracy, up to the citizens to sort of voice their concern. Edmonton is an example where we worked on with the Edmonton Regional Growth Plan that they had to manage the growth around Edmonton. Now, Edmonton, like in Alberta, I the population growth that came into Alberta was like the province with the largest increase, perhaps next to Ontario or something, and huge pressures around Edmonton. And of course, that's prime agriculture land around Edmonton. So they worked together, and they sort of develop their priorities around what land should be developed, how the criteria that should be used to evaluate it. Now they did put restrictions on the prime land, so that is that's the last area that you're going to develop, and but they work very closely with the municipalities so that if one municipality wants to develop its land, it has to go to the region, and it's sort of looked through the lens of all the criteria of prioritizing it. So you kind of have to bring some things up to a higher level to make sure that it's done, not piecemeal little fragments here and there. And so that's in terms of the planning, municipal planning, provincial planning rules, things like that. Otherwise, there's incentives that need to be required. Sensitive lands, so the conservation voice has to be in there. And because of all these conflicting viewpoints in this issue, you have to have them work together. You have to consult. You have to ensure that it's balanced. But it's pretty difficult when land values go up and the farmer that's been waiting to retire would like to take his retirement. It's pretty difficult to sort of, the other issue is that the land municipal planning takes place over a very long term. So they've already decided 20 years ago what land around the cities that they're going to develop. And do the citizens know that? The developers know it. They're sitting on the land. They know that it's going to be coming up for development. And apparently they're in the city councilors' offices every week, they know they're working. So there's things like that are making land use planning around cities, and there's just too many jurisdictions and not enough information, not enough transparency. And then so from
again,
that point of view,
a wicked problem, to use the term again, because you're also dealing with short-term political incentives too that decision makers are facing, and so that's something that is in the face of all of this. Tom earlier mentioned the discrepancy in the value of cropland versus grassland or land used for cattle production in Western Canada. And to me, there's one policy example here that we could maybe get into. I'm not sure. Maybe it's more of a Western Canadian perspective, but I see this crop insurance discussion around risk management and risk management tools available to farmers of crops. Essentially, the feeling that there's better risk management tools for land that's in crop versus in cattle production. And to me, that would be an example too of where there could be a policy conversation that influences how land gets used when it comes to the creation of some of these risk management tools. Margaret, would that make sense in terms of fitting into this type of discussion?
Yes, we've heard that, right? We were doing, Tom and I and Al Muscle were doing some work for the Canadian Roundtable Sustainable Beef and Environment Canada around the biodiversity strategy. And we interviewed ranchers and farmers, academics and NGOs, and we did hear that issue, that there seems to be that crop insurance does seem to provide this protection, against that livestock producers might not get. So yes, there appears to be a certain amount of inequitable program coverage that would provide one an advantage versus another, and the pressures on converting pasture land or grazing lands to croplands, especially in the face of record high commodity prices. So yeah, the ag stabilization and the BRM programming perhaps needs to be reviewed in the context of of and ecological services and preserving land and with that priority. So,
Tom, that's an example where it's not a carrot, a direct payment for an ecological goods or service, but it is a policy framework decision that is impacting how land gets used.
Yes, yes, it is. And to complete the story about the the early experiments on land conversion in the U.S. versus Canada, brought about by the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. You know, in the United States, they're extremely rich, or maybe they're in debt, but their practice always seemed to be to create conservation incentives and then subsidies, and then provide other subsidies to undo the effects of those subsidies and to layer subsidies on subsidies. And I had to explain to my colleagues in the waterfowl world that, well, for example, if you wanted more permanent cover in Canada, then we had to address this huge issue of all of this cropland appearing at the and wetlands disappearing and so forth. So, I mean, Canada was, 1/10 the economy and 1/10 the population and 1/10 the Olympic medals and everything else. How are we going to do that? Well, we beavered away, pun intended, on dismantling crop insurance programs that were having perverse unintended consequences to breaking the prairie. We took apart the Crow's Nest Pass freight rail subsidy, and slowly we started to see the permanent cover come back, because now the marginal land, well, the input costs to farm that marginal land they weren't able to pay those down now without those other subsidies, right? So you had these market distorting subsidies that were driving all that land conversion. And just the other day, I'm listening to a discussion on Ducks Unlimited's newish marginal lands program, they call it. So in addition to buying like a section and then putting it back to grassland and doing the buy, save, sell thing, they're using the smart technology to actually show farmers where the difference between where their profit, after taking account of their fixed costs and their variable costs on a 10 meter by 10 meter square almost, they can decide where to be more efficient applying what chemicals they need to, in terms of the reward, in terms of yield for these highly variable fields and so forth. And they're calling that their marginal lands program. And so, I don't know, it's the older I get, the more things look the same. Like, you feel like I've been here before. Like the disguise is different, the actor's different, the stage is different, but the play's the same. So I think there's some messages that we can take out of those earlier experiments about how to do this. But I would ask Nicholas, when we've talked about this with other people on the land, I mean, on the conservation side, folks are worried, and government, they're worried about this thing they call additionality. Like, well, if we give it to why would we give money to somebody who wasn't going to do, drain that wetland anyway, or convert that grassland anyway, right? And I don't know. My off the cuff response at the time, completely naive, coming from my background, was, well, this is Canada, for God's sake. I mean, do we worry that somebody, gets medical care or dental care and so forth? Is the economists have a word for it? I call it gaming the system or something, right? To get the money when they never really intended to do anything with that land other than leave it the way it was instead of farm it or something, or develop it in this case. What do you think about additionality? Sorry, Kelvin, I'm asking the questions here now.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's an important question, because you look at there's farmers across Western Canada that adopted zero-till practices in the 90s, and now there's recognition of the major carbon sequestration that happened there, and they're wondering, like, is there an incentive for having done this now, or do we get recognized for this? And Nicholas, do you have thoughts on that question of additionality?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I'll give you an example. there is one farmer in Quebec who does what you call the zero tilling, and he's giving advice to the Ukrainians. He has been awarded many soil conservation awards, and he's been doing zero till since 30 years. So you won't see him with 4% organic matter on his land. It's much more, and you won't see him going in the manifestation saying I'm missing money and things like that. So having that, he cut his cost of operation. He has built his a soil resistancy. And if I come back to it's the same, I ask some of the responsible, why don't you pay farmers who are at the cream? They were the pilot, they were the reference, and you don't pay them. I mean, I don't get it. So if you are at the end of the train, you get paid, and if you are at the top on the locomotive, you don't get any, I would say, recognition unless you got a price, like, oh, he's a good soil conservation. Now, if I go back to Western Canada, true, they went on semi-direct, what you call that zero tilling, and they have built their, I would say, their organic matter. But the reason is economic. The size of the farm makes that, wow, man, I won't plow that land because. So it was mostly economic reasons, but I don't see why they shouldn't get paid or get rewarded for that. The only thing we can see is that these guys will be the people who conserve their land the best. They will be in business 20 years down the road because they have built a land which is resilient. The one who are getting old and want to get, I would say who doesn't take the soil health in consideration, even with the technology. I went to a seminar where they talk about the 4B, like the where you have the GPS, you have the seed, you have at the good place, at the good nutrient, at the good place, at the good. Anyway, there's 4B.
4R, yeah.
Yeah. And you know what, Margaret? The thing for me is that the best technology is under your feet. It's your soil health. A good soil health is like an athlete. You can ask performance. Sometimes he will need or she will need an aspirin for a headache. But if my land is in good health, I will go through it. So it's a term of this mentality has to evolve. How do you do that? This is why I'm always asking myself, how do we pay producers for ecological services? That might help, but we have to find a way to pay for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a conversation that. Oh, go ahead, Tom. Last
No,
thoughts.
I just have to say, your story reminds me, Nicholas, of my best friend from graduate school who, upon embarking on his wildlife biology career, decided he was a grain farmer from Alberta, did work on Arctic geese, decided that, he was never going to survive in the civil service. He just couldn't take the prairie grain farmer out of the guy, if you get my drift. And he went back farming in Alberta in 1989. And he started what all his neighbors thought was just the craziest, like, what is he doing? Letting weeds build up on his fallow land until they were just about to flower, and then pumping that stuff back into the soil, zero till otherwise. Within a few years, his yields were through the roof, and he was one of the most successful farmers in his neighborhood. And people started to practice what he was practicing. Word gets around in the coffee shop, right? So, he's been my pulse on everything agricultural in the prairies for 30 years, 40 years. So it's and a huge asset in my life. But anyway, I just wanted to add that because it sounds like the same kind of guy, the same kind of process by which the community learns to change behaviors.
And that's actually something that we're going to be talking about. We have an upcoming episode here on the economics and the stuff that happens behind the scenes on land use changes that goes into those decisions. And so
Cool.
A bunch of these topics that we've covered in this initial episode, we are going to be exploring in more depth in the coming months here on the Ag Policy Connection. And for now, though, I think we have used up enough of our panelists' time today. Thank you, Margaret, Tom, and Nicholas, for providing your rich, insightful perspectives on this topic. And we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Just a small taste of what's to come here on season 3 of the Ag Policy Connection podcast. If you've any thoughts or questions, though, that come to mind listening to today's panel with Margaret, Nicholas, and Tom, my email address is khepner@realagriculture.com. There are certainly plenty of examples of land use challenges and areas of conflict where policy resolution is needed. Looking forward to diving into this topic here in the coming weeks, as we'll be discussing the economics of land use decisions, who should get to decide how land is used. And on the next episode, look forward to discussing the role of data, new methods of data collection, innovative approaches to preserving farmland while promoting conservation and biodiversity. That's coming up on our next episode here on the Ag Policy Connection podcast. I'm your host, Kelvin Hepner. The Ag Policy Connection is brought to you by Real Agriculture and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute.